Okay, we're picking up with the June 2017 U.S. History exam, picking up where we left off, so with question number 22 now. They give you a document here, a slightly modified mock-up of the original, which this is a real newspaper, but it's, they've modified it a little bit for the exam. So when you see this, what should you be thinking about? Well, first of all, if you're really sharp and you know your stuff, you'll recognize the New York Journal right away. That's William, if I can get this to work, William Randolph Hearst. Maybe we'll try it a little. Okay, we'll do it this way. So you should be thinking about William. There we go. Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. So Pulitzer ran a newspaper called the New York World, and Hearst ran a newspaper called the New York Journal. And those were the flagship newspapers. They both owned giant, massive national chains of newspapers across the country. So those were sort of their headquarters here in New York. The Journal and the World, this is now the late 1800s, were among the more advanced versions of newspapering at the time. They had very fast presses. They could turn out hundreds of thousands of copies a day. And it was all about that war between them for circulation, who could sell the most newspapers. And in those days, just as in today, what sells newspapers? Lurid headlines, blood and gore, getting people's emotions going. The average person doesn't buy a newspaper or even tune in today to TV or cable news because a very calm, boring-looking fellow who's got a PhD in economics is going to explain to them the latest tax bill. Maybe people should pay attention to that, but they don't. What they like is something entertaining, something that gets their blood boiling. And people in the business today will tell you, it doesn't matter whether you love or hate CNN or Fox News or Anderson Cooper or Sean Hannity. It's just that you have an emotional reaction, because then you'll tune in. And you may tune in to sit there hating the guy, or you may sit there cheering for him, but you're tuning in. And the same thing was true back in this day of newspapering. What they wanted was an emotional reaction, because that got you interested and that got you buying the paper. So both of these newspapers tended to find the most scandalous, violent, sex-ridden murder stories or conspiracy theories or that sort of stuff that gets people, their blood boiling. They both also printed comics in their newspapers, and this was the very, very early days of comics. So and I suppose I should show you this. So this is a character called the Yellow Kid. And as you see, he's this weird-looking kid with the big ears and this big long T-shirt. It was a nightshirt that he was supposed to be wearing. And in the days before you had word bubbles, where characters would have a balloon coming out of their mouth with words in it, the Yellow Kid, whatever he had to say, was printed on his shirt. And the comic strip that he was part of was actually a thing called Hogan's Alley, which was all of these crazy characters in it. Most of them were kids, and most of them were different immigrant groups. So it was kind of the working class immigrant groups' satire and commentary on New York life. It was done by a guy named Utkolt, was the artist. Okay, so the Yellow Kid shows up in comics in both their newspapers, And to test their color printing processes, they use this yellow color to see, because printing in color was kind of a new thing for newspapers. All right, so there's the yellow kid. They therefore come to be known as yellow journalism, because the newspapers had all this yellow printing in it. The style of journalism that was all about sensationalism and exaggeration and conspiracy theories came to be known as yellow journalism. And Pulitzer and Hearst, if I can pull this out here for a minute, were kind of the kings of yellow journalism. And that's Joseph Pulitzer there. That's William Randolph Hearst. They would have been instantly recognizable to people of 1890s. Right away, they would have recognized those faces. And you see they're both dressed as the Yellow Kid and putting up these blocks for war, because there were many in the United States who criticized them over the Spanish-American War. As you should remember from your U.S. history, the Spanish-American War was fought in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. You had a revolution from some of the locals in Cuba against the Spanish government. They were tired of being a Spanish colony. There were a lot of Americans who saw an opportunity in that. If they weren't going to be a Spanish colony, maybe we could turn them into a kind of American colony. This is the age of imperialism. So if I pull up some space here again. So when you're talking about the 1890s, you're talking about the age of imperialism. Who gets involved in imperialism? Pretty much everybody. The European countries all have colonies all around the world, South America, Africa, and Asia. And the United States wants to get in on this. Colonies in the 1890s, just like colonies back in the 16 and 1700s, were all about economics. You wanted a colonial empire because colonies gave you easy, cheap access to raw materials. You brought that back to the mother country, manufactured it into some other goods, and then shipped it back to the colonies to be resold. So colonies gave you access to cheap and easy raw materials and also access to new markets to sell the manufactured products that were coming out of your home country. Spain had been a great colonial empire. It was really on the skids by the 1890s. France and Britain were still big colonial empires. The European countries were getting into colonies all over. Even Germany and Belgium had colonies in Africa. And so the United States never had what were technically colonies. But by the 1890s, we got our hands on Hawaii, a spot of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the real purpose of which was to get us to a jumping off point for trade with China and Japan. Pacific Ocean is a huge place, so having an island in the middle of it where your ships could stop, refuel, pick up supplies, navigate, gave you a nice advantage. So we wanted Hawaii for that reason, and Hawaii is also a very fertile place. Great for growing sugarcane. So the sugar planters wanted a tax-free, duty-free market to import Hawaiian sugar into the U.S. You could make a lot of money that way. At the same time that the Hawaii thing was happening, we started looking at things like the Philippines. The Philippines has got access to rubber markets, and you needed natural rubber from rubber trees in those days. It wasn't easy to make it. and it was a nice jumping off point again for Chinese and Japanese trade. And we were looking at the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Cuba. Once again, a lot of it about sugar and sugarcane. That's an obsession that Europe and the United States have had that has gone on since the 1600s. If you remember way back, the French and Indian War. At the end of the French and Indian War, France lost, the British won. And they gave France a choice. You can either give up this little tiny island called Martinique in the Caribbean and give that to Britain in payment for having lost the war, or you can give up Canada. And the French chose to give up all of Canada and what would become the American Midwest. Yeah, in the 1760s, when they lost the French and Indian War, France gave to Britain all of Canada and what is going to become someday the American Midwest, rather than give up a little tiny island called Martinique. Why? Because little tiny Martinique produced more revenue with its sugar cane than all the rest of their colonies combined. So by the 1890s, sugar is still an important product. Now we're looking at rubber, we're looking at tropical fruit. Americans had a great appetite for fruit grown in the Caribbean area. And so this revolution in Cuba, some Americans look at it as a way to liberate these poor Cubans from Spanish domination, so they could have a free and independent republic of their own. Some Americans looked on it as a business opportunity. We could turn Cuba into not technically a colony, but a dependency on the United States. And so we encouraged that revolution, and we fought the Spanish-American War over that revolution in Cuba. Okay. The Hearst and Pulitzer saw an opportunity for their newspapers in getting the American public's blood up and anger up and encouraging them to get into that war. And so their newspapers really pushed for the U.S. to enter. Which gets us to this newspaper. So in 1898, the United States, this is before we get involved in the war. We are not involved in the Spanish-American War, but we are favoring the Cuban revolutionaries. But we're not part of it yet. We send down the USS Maine, which was a battleship, the latest and greatest and best of the American battleships, and it parks in Havana Harbor. The Maine blows up, blasts to smithereens in the middle of the harbor, and sinks. Why? Most historians, most scientists today believe that it blew up by accident. The Maine was a coal-fired steamship. So they had huge bins of coal in the ship. You fed that into a furnace that produced steam that ran the ship. Coal, of course, will burn, but it doesn't explode. Coal dust, however, can be explosive. If you have huge bins of coal, they're going to grind against each other, the bits of coal, and create coal dust. And a room full of coal powder dust in the air, if you light a match, that will explode. And they think that that's actually what blew up the Maine. Nobody wanted to hear that explanation at the time, though. They wanted to say it was sabotage, terrorism by Spain. And so the New York Journal and other newspapers started the drumbeat to try to anger the American people in demanding the United States go to war over this terrorist attack on the USS Maine. Okay, so there we go. Destruction of Maine was the work of an enemy, we're told. Yeah. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. That Assistant Secretary Roosevelt there you should recognize, is Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Before he ever becomes president, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He'll be so angry by this that he resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and starts his own military unit called the Rough Riders, and brings them down to Cuba at his own expense and fights in the war and becomes a war hero as a result of it. Here you see the newspaper offering $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. So this newspaper is offering anybody who comes up with evidence, which, talk about getting people's interest. If you can be a smart detective and figure out who blew up the Maine, we'll pay you 50 grand. This was really meant to sell newspapers, but it also got Americans interested in going to war with Spain. So we get to question 22. What was a major purpose of these 1898 newspaper headlines? Correct answer: rallying support for a declaration of war with Spain. They were not out to promote peace between Spain and the U.S. Obviously, that's very inflammatory headlines. Supporting humanitarian aid for the suffering people of Cuba. There's not a word about the suffering people of Cuba here. There were other newspaper stories about how terribly the Spanish were treating the poor Cubans, but that's not in this newspaper, so it's not relevant to the question. Punishing the citizens of Cuba. No, because the enemy, you should know, was meant to be Spain. That was the empire we were going after. Okay, so we can look at our next question here. If I can get this to work. Wham. Okay. Question 23. Overcrowding, high crime rate, poor sanitation. What do those sound like? Overcrowding, high crime rate, poor sanitation. Well, if you just look at those, you should be thinking probably what? Urban poverty. Whoops. So overcrowding, because you're inside a city. That's sort of definition of a city. High crime rate. Wherever you have poor neighborhoods, people are easily taken advantage of. Yeah, they tend to be powerless, and there's less security for them, and so criminals can do their thing. And poor sanitation. In the late 1800s, early 20th century, you didn't have modern sewer systems the way you do now. You didn't have the garbage was not picked up the same way. You still had horses around, so the streets were full of horse manure, and so this was a constant problem in poor neighborhoods. In the early 1900s, here's our question. These problems were most directly the result of what? The Muckrakers' influence? The Muckrakers, you should remember, were the reformer, progressive journalists who were writing newspaper articles, magazine articles, and books, in many cases, to try to address the problems of the late 1800s and early 1900s. So when you talk about the Muckrakers, you should be thinking about whom? Oh, let me pull this up. Whammo. It's a pain in the neck. There we go. Okay, so when we talk about the Muckrakers, if I can get this to work, Muckrakers, you're thinking about people like Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, which is about the horrors of immigrant workers had to face. That was really what the jungle was supposed to be about. But what everybody remembers is the meatpacking industry. So he wrote about the terrible conditions that immigrants were subjected to in the meatpacking industry. What everybody remembered was the filth and disgusting practices that the meat business had and what was actually showing up in your butcher shop. You had Ida Tarbell, who went after the Standard Oil Company. And that's John D. Rockefeller. So she wrote The History of Standard Oil was the name of her book. And Standard Oil was that monopoly on the oil business. Rockefeller was the head of it. The average person didn't really understand how monopolies worked, what made them so bad for business as well as for consumers, and how a company got to be a monopoly. So Ida Tarbell really kind of opened people's eyes to that. You had Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis. How the Other Half Lives. So Jacob Riis was a New York City newspaper guy who by accident, he was really a reporter, but because he couldn't get photographers to go with him into the worst of the slums of the city, he started taking pictures himself. How the Other Half Lives is a book about urban poverty and the really horrible treatment that many people suffered. Thousands and thousands of orphans in New York City at the time, living on the street, just in poverty we can't even imagine. And wealthy people in the city really had no idea about this. The two neighborhoods had nothing to do with each other. So if you were living uptown Manhattan in a nice house, you had no idea what was just a few blocks away. Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, exposed that to people. The other muckrakers included guys like Lincoln Steffens, Shame of the Cities. Steffens was wrote about urban political machines, so corrupt politicians who rigged elections and things like that in the city so that a handful of people really controlled all the power in some of these big cities. And also, we should also include Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus, which was a novel, but an expository novel about the railroad monopoly that was choking farmers and small business guys out in California in particular. It was what the book was about, but it was happening across the country. And we should also, I suppose, mention Ida B. Wells here, who was a black female journalist, which was, unusual in so many ways at that time. But she was an African-American woman journalist who wrote extensively and campaigned against lynching. And that's the practice of that sort of vigilante law, where in the South people would get together and just grab a black guy and hang him, sometimes for no reason, and sometimes just because somebody had a grudge against him. Okay, so the muckrakers in general here, the thing to know about them is that they're from that progressive era. They're all about reform, and particularly about government using its power for reform of labor practices, so safer labor practices, getting rid of child labor, for dealing with the incredible poverty that people had in cities, for breaking up unfair businesses and exploitative businesses, for and you know, this is just some of the more famous muckrakers. But the muckrakers themselves, not only were they progressives, but the thing about them, there were a lot of people in the progressive movement, right, is they were journalists. So all of them wrote for magazines, which were very important at the time, newspapers, and many of them also wrote books or compiled their articles into books. So we get back to the questions at hand here. And let me find it. The muckrakers' influence would have been against all of these things. They were not so these problems of overcrowding, high crime, poor sanitation, this is what the muckrakers were campaigning against and trying to get somebody to fix. Conservation programs. Conservation was the word at the time that we might use today about environmentalism, an awareness of ecology, and trying to preserve land, natural beauty, and that sort of thing. Thing to notice about conservation. The word conservation, to conserve something, means to save it, to preserve it. And the emphasis around 1900 on conservation was saving the wilderness of America for future generations. The biggest conservationist out there probably was Teddy Roosevelt. When he became president, he really gave us the national park system that we think of. And his argument was, it's all great, progress, business, technology, but we want the next generation and generations after that to be able to see, you know, Yosemite the way it originally was when the Native Americans, you know, first laid eyes on it. And they should be able to see the deserts of, you know, Death Valley and some of the mountains in the Rockies, the Grand Tetons. We should conserve those unspoiled so that that wilderness is not lost, that we'll have a piece of it, so future generations will always be able to sort of touch it. That's a little different from environmentalism today. Now, environmentalism is a lot wider and, if you like, a little more scientific. We now understand things about air pollution and water pollution and what you have to do, the kinds of rules, for instance, you have to put on industry to prevent air pollution. A power plant in Illinois that is burning coal, and this is, you know, well-known science, will actually create acid rain and pollution in New York because you get the drift of the clouds. So modern environmentalism has somewhat different emphasis and different approach than conservation at the time. Conservation at the time was all about big national parks and preserving little spots of wilderness. Overcrowding, high crime, poor sanitation are not a result of that. Westward migration. Well, you can't really talk about overcrowding with westward migration. The point of westward migration is always that the crowding in the eastern cities was too much, and so people were getting away from it. Rapid urbanization. That would be the best answer there. Urbanization is the process of citifying things, turning things into cities, and when it happens too quickly and without a lot of careful planning, what you wind up with is slums, concentrated neighborhoods, too many people in too small a space. There's no way you can run an effective sanitation system if there are too many people bunched up. And so the overcrowding leads to the poor sanitation and the high crime. Number 24, let's look at. The early 1900s, Congress acted to regulate the nation's money supply more effectively by doing something. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. Nation's money supply. Who cares? Okay. So the basic law of all economics, and you can't understand history unless you understand something about economics and vice versa, is supply and demand. Supply is how much of something you have that you want to sell. Demand is how much people want. So when supply is high and demand is low, you have a warehouse full of widgets that you want to sell. Not too many people want widgets. What happens to the price of your widgets? Your price goes down. Why? You can say it's $100 a widget, but nobody wants one. Nobody's going to pay you that. Maybe if you drop the price to $1 a widget, you'll find enough people who are saying, I'll spend $1 and sell it. That means that the value of each widget is lower, right? On the other hand, if the supply is low and the demand is high, the price goes up. Why? There's not much gold in the world. There's a very small amount, and it's very hard to get. Mining gold is a difficult, expensive process. People love gold. They like gold because, forget about the price for a minute. Why would people like gold? Forget the price. It's good looking. It's a beautiful, that rich yellow, red-yellow color to it. It doesn't rust, doesn't oxidize. Like even silver, which is very nice, will tarnish. It'll turn dark, it'll turn black. Gold doesn't tarnish, it doesn't rust. And it's easy to use. If you know anything about gold, it's a relatively soft metal, and you can stretch it out. So you can make very thin gold foil. You can draw it out into wire, which makes it easy to use to make jewelry and, put on, you can put a little foil of it into a book and illuminate the manuscript, as we say. You have real gold, very micro-thin layer of gold on the letters. All sorts of neat stuff you can do with it. So gold, since ancient time, has been in demand, high demand, and there's very little of it. Well, if everybody wants my widget, let's say, and there's only a few of them, I can run an auction, and people will be willing to pay higher and higher prices to get it. So that's the law of supply and demand. When supply is too high and demand is too low, prices drop. When supply is too low and demand is too high, prices go up. And when you have enough of something to fill people's needs, and people want something and are getting it relatively easily, the price is stable. All right. Well, what has that got to do with money? Money works exactly the same way. A dollar bill, if there are few of them, each is worth more, but hard to get. If there are a lot of them, each is worth less, but easy to get. So what does that mean? If I'm running a little island, let's say, I have my own island that I'm king of, and our whole economy only has $100 in it, right? That's all we've got. Each of those dollars is going to be valuable. I want to get my hand on that dollar because I want money that I can put aside and spend when I feel like it. And so with very few dollars in my economic system, each one is harder to get, and I'm willing to give you more to get it. You know, I'm willing to give you a box full of candy bars for that $1. On the other hand, if I have a printing press and I make $10,000, there's a lot more out there. They're a lot easier to get your hands on. I might be only willing to give you one candy bar for that dollar instead of a box full of them. So the value of each individual dollar goes down as there are more of them in the system. Okay. If the value of each one goes down, then I'm going to get less for each dollar. That means prices go up. So if each dollar is worth less, you need to give me more dollars to get what I have. So the price, the number of dollars you pay, rises. That's called inflation. Too many dollars in the system is inflation. On the other hand, if there are too few dollars in the system, I can't get my hands on any, and therefore I can't function. I can't get money to run my business, and business starts to slow down. All through the 1800s, the United States and many other countries went through this period of boom and bust. Boom and bust is what? The economy goes up, 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 and then all of a sudden crashes. And up, 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 and crashes. Very unstable. I have a dollar bill. I don't know whether it's going to buy me one candy bar or a whole candy factory. Week to week, it changes. In the 1800s, we called that a panic. So you read about the Panic of 1875 and all of this. The panic is just, what's the modern word? A depression. Like the Great Depression. That's what a panic is. It's just a sudden depression. And all of a sudden, everybody's out of work. Or you can't buy anything. Nobody's got any money. Okay. So what's the solution to this? Stabilizing your economic system. Making sure that you have the right amount of dollars in the system, not too many, not too few. And adjusting that when economic conditions call for it. So, if you start to see inflation, too many dollars in the system, you have to have a way to take some of those dollars out. If you start to see the economy slow down, there's not enough dollars and businesses can't expand, they're not hiring any new people. You need a way to pump dollars into the system. So you have to have a way to take a few dollars out when you need to and to put some more dollars in when you need to. How do you do that? Well, that's why we invented, right around World War I, the Federal Reserve System. So the Federal Reserve System is a set of banks. There are banks in each of the major cities across the country: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco. And the Federal Reserve banks are a kind of part of the federal government. They function independently, but they are, if you like, owned by the federal government. And this is the way the Fed, you hear about this if you follow economic news, um, what the Fed does gets very complicated. It has to do with interest rates on debt. But the basic idea of what it does is relatively simple. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply. Their job, Federal Reserve has what's called a dual mandate. This is a bit sophisticated for the Regents, but you're smart guys, I'm sure. So the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve System. Control the money supply. 2, minimize inflation. Maximize employment. Now, those two things don't go together. The more money that's in the system, the more businesses expand, the more they can borrow money, they can expand their factories, they can hire people. So the more money that's in the system, the more you maximize employment. The problem is that the more money you put in the system, the more you create inflation. Each dollar is worth less, prices go up, and consumers have to pay more. So you take money out in order to minimize inflation. But then you start dropping employment, because if it's harder to get money, I have to pay higher. I'm going to have a problem paying wages. I'm going to have a problem expanding my business, and so business slows down. So what the Federal Reserve has to do is find a very, very, very delicate balance. And when inflation starts to rise, you take some money out. And when the economy starts to slow down, you put some money back in. And they have to walk this very fine line of constantly adjusting interest rates. That's how they do it. I won't go into all that, but through interest rates to meet that dual mandate. And the goal, what's the ultimate goal? Is what? Stability. To smooth out the highs and the lows so that the economy is predictable. That's the worst thing in the world for business, is when things are unpredictable. If things are going up or going down, as long as a business knows that, they can plan for it, they can work around it. It's when it's unstable that they can't deal with it. Okay, so we get back to our question. In the early 1900s, Congress acted to regulate the nation's money supply by creating the Federal Reserve System. There it is. What are your other choices there? Adopting the Clayton Antitrust Act. When you see Clayton Antitrust Act here, you should be thinking, whoops, hang on, Sherman, man, I hate this. Okay. When you see Clayton Antitrust Act, if I can get this to work properly, you should be thinking the Sherman Act and the Northern Securities case. Sorry for the sloppiness, but when I do it in this frame, this is what I have to put up with. So the Sherman Act, Sherman, is the other antitrust act. The Clayton Act and the Sherman Act were both about monopolies. The first time they get used seriously in a court case is the Northern Securities case. So if you see Clayton, Sherman, or Northern Securities, you're thinking monopoly, antitrust, anti-monopoly. That doesn't apply here. The Congress did pass the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, but it had nothing to do with the money supply. It had to do with monopolies, which is a different problem. Protective tariff. We remember the tariff. The tariff is a tax on imports. The idea of a protective tariff is you tax the living daylights out of imports, which drives the price up. So if I'm England and I'm shipping widgets to America, and I'm selling my widgets for $10 a piece, and America puts a $10 tariff on it, that's a tax I have to pay. Now I have to sell my widgets for $20 a piece to make my money back. If an American company can make widgets for $15 a piece, well, they're more expensive than my widgets were originally, but they are less than my widgets with the tariff on it. And so, in theory, people will buy the American-made widgets instead of the foreign ones. That's the point of a protective tariff. Again, that has nothing to do with money supply and is a different problem and question. And finally, increasing the minimum wage. Minimum wage, as some of you guys may know, you may have experience with it, is the minimum amount that an employer is allowed to pay per hour to an employee. There's a federal minimum wage. There's the federal government mandates that for the country. And then individual states are allowed to have their own on top of that. So some states have a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. That's because the cost of living is different in parts of the country. If you've traveled much, and you guys might not see it with the kind of things you buy, but your parents can tell you, the cost of a house, what you would pay for a simple, modest, one-family, three-bedroom home on Staten Island, you could buy 3 or 4 houses for in Tennessee. And I'm not making that up. I'm not exaggerating. If a modest house on Staten Island is $500,000, you can get a nice house in other parts of the country for $100,000. Now, you're living in New York, so you get all the advantages of being in New York, and the wages, the salaries here reflect this. So in New York, you'll make 3 or 4 times for a job. A New York City police officer, just to pick something, makes 2 or 3 times what a police officer in certain other rural counties in America make. On the other hand, his expenses are more, and in a rural county, your expenses are a lot less. So he's got about the same lifestyle. Because of that, states can set their own minimum wages. Setting a minimum wage for a business, though, does nothing for the money supply for the country. It's how much you're paid, but it's not how many dollars are floating around in the whole economic system. It doesn't create money. So even though Congress, the progressives, did want the minimum wage created and then raised, it didn't have anything to do with money supply. The only one that does that is the Federal Reserve. Okay, I'm going to leave it there because I don't want each of these individual videos to go on too long, and we'll pick it up with the next one.